June 1944. Rechlin airfield, Germany. The twin rows of hardstands along the Müritz lakes were crowded with aircraft in every state of undress. Cowls open like gills, wings chalked with notes, oil darkening the concrete where mechanics had spent the night. At the far edge of the field, a shape unfamiliar to most of the ground crew sat under a guard of felgued armory. For engines caged by square-cut nacelles, a shoulder-mounted wing with a span that seemed to float above the grass. The stenciling had been overpainted, the stars and bars hidden beneath imperfect Balkan crews, but the silhouette was unmistakable to anyone who read Allied intelligence reports. A consolidated B-24 Liberator, captured nearly intact after a forced landing in occupied territory, and ferried here for evaluation by the Versuchsverband, under the Oberbefehlshaber. The test pilot assigned that morning had flown Ru-88s and Du-17s on night raids, had felt a B-24's defensive shells splash across his canopy on a bad intercept near Kossel, and he stepped up the ladder now with a pencil stub behind his ear and a small notebook in his pocket. His job was the same as every pilot who rolled down Rechlin's runways in an enemy airframe: measure, compare, and translate performance into survival odds for Germans who would meet this machine in the sky. The thesis announced itself as soon as the preflight ended. The Liberator's defensive architecture and the way American crews flew it linked in daylight combat. Boxers that layered arcs of fire were a weapons system in their own right. Rechlin's engineering section wanted rates of climb and fuel curves. Fighter Geschwader downrange wanted something simpler. How close could a Bf-109 get and live? The Liberator that Rechlin received was a late production airframe with powered turrets, fore and aft, and a belly position that had already been modified in the field. The test team weighed it with a standard internal fuel load, loaded ballast to simulate ammunition and crew, and recorded the positions of its Browning and M2.50 caliber guns. 10 guns in this configuration was common, according to captured manuals and crews, each firing roughly 700 to 800 rounds per minute in the air. German analysts converted that to a per-second measure out of habit. A single .50 could throw about 12 rounds each second, and a full Liberator on station could deliver around 120 rounds per second in overlapping fields. That number meant little on paper until the pilot strapped in and taxied to the threshold and imagined 36 machines like this one stepping down off the Baltic haze in tight order, each spilling a curtain of metal into the approach lanes. The first test sorties did not chase numbers, they chased feel. German pilots used the Liberator's high-spec Davis wing as a mental landmark during formation attacks, and the Rechlin flyer wanted to know how that wing spoke to his hands when the aircraft was heavy and low. He lifted off at 115 to 120 miles per hour indicated, climbed shallow to keep the turrets stable for vibration checks, and leveled near 1,000 meters to test trim changes as he extended and retracted the nose turret. The engineering officer in the right seat called out the forces. The gun positions were not just weapons, they were aerodynamic bodies that moved the airplane's center of pressure. The nose turret in the extended position cost speed, but gave a forward cone that German reports consistently underestimated. In the second sortie, the team built a simulated combat box with cameras instead of guns. Rechlin had no way to conjure an entire American group, but they could fly the Liberator with 2 Bf-110s in trail with film magazines. The pilot held headings while the twin-engine Germans moved through the standard attack geometries that had evolved over 2 bitter years of daylight. Defense and daylight bombing. Frontal quarter attacks, the diagrams said, were the only consistent way to shear a bomber's cockpit and engines before the escorts arrived. The footage confirmed why veteran intercept leaders repeated that lesson like a catechism. The Liberator's tail arc was brutal. The late production, a 6B tail turret, covered a hemisphere with twin 50s that punished any closing speed from us. The belly arcs were dangerous until the approach tightened into angles below about 5 degrees. And the nose arc, thanks to powered traverse and the sheer number of barrels able to swivel forward from multiple stations, made a head-on run survivable only as a coordinated act by multiple fighters at once. German pilots already knew this from loss reports. Rechlin's film made it tactile. The pilot landed after that second flight and wrote a single sentence that his engineering chief underlined. The B-24's firepower is not its 10 guns. It is the way 20 or 30 aircraft stitch those arcs together. That sentence implied a simple arithmetic he could feel in his ribs. In a standard American group, 3 squadrons stacked and stepped back. A pilot, flying a 109 into that box, had to fly through the combined defensive rate of fire of the front 2 or 3 elements before even reaching the lead. If each aircraft could sustain roughly 120 rounds per second when guns were hot, a 21 plane box could throw on the order of 2,500 rounds every second. Even after accounting for traverse limits and the real cadence of gunners' bracketing bursts. In practice, this was less about exact figures and more about density. The interceptor's task was to align trajectory within a corridor filled with metal. And Rechlin's pilot was honest in his post-flight brief in mass. The Liberator's defensive system produced a volume German heavy bombers, rarely achieved even when their gunners all fired together. That admission did not mean the Liberator was invulnerable. The test team found what German combat experience had already mapped. The Davis wing gave the B-24 range and cruise efficiency at the cost of low-speed handling in damage. Its high-mounted, relatively thin wing let the aircraft carry fuel deep in the wing, but could snap hard if an engine fire burned through a spar. The long, rectangular fuselage flexed under turbulence, shaking sights and complicating fine gunnery. The cockpit's side-by-side seating gave decent visibility, but placed a busy panel between pilot and co-pilot that looked alien to German eyes. What impressed the Luftwaffe officers more than any cockpit layout was the way American technical doctrine wrapped around the airframe. The Liberator was not the most graceful, heavy bomber. The B-17 was often judged steadier on 3 engines and more forgiving in a dive. What the B-24 offered was mass and speed, delivered by an industry that could feed groups with airframes and spares. On a calendar cadence, the Reich could not match. When the Rechlin crew measured fuel burn at military power and compared it to range tables from captured 8th Air Force documents, they understood why American planners chose the Liberator for long legs to the Ploiesti oil fields and deep strikes into Silesia. Even at a cruising true airspeed, around 290 miles per hour, when clean and high, it could carry a useful load farther than most German twins and many German heavies that existed mostly as paper programs by 1944. The numbers grew starker when the test team set the Liberator beside domestic comparators. The Heinkel He 177A series, Germany's only operational heavy, was theoretically a fast 4-engine bomber. In practice, it was 2 coupled engines per wing, with a nasty tendency to overheat, and, in early variants, burn. The Rechlin engineering officer spoke clinically in the debrief, comparing weapon stations, ammunition loads, and traverse fields. A typical He 177 tail position carried a 13mm MG 131. Sometimes upgraded, and lateral defense positions mounted similar weapons. On paper, the He 177 could throw defensive fire. In combat, the distribution of stations and the reality of crew workloads meant far fewer simultaneous arcs. The Liberator's solution-standardized powered turrets, with .50 caliber barrels and clear sectors that cruise, drilled relentlessly put metal into the precise volumes an attacker would occupy. The test pilot did not call it superior or inferior. He called it coherent. And that was the word he used later when he briefed fighter commanders who needed to translate tests into tactics. Coherent meant predictable. Predictable meant dangerous if you flew into its plan. German doctrine had evolved to meet that problem long before June 1944. Frontal mass attacks with 109s and 190s were an answer born in blood. And the deployment of heavy cannon like the Mk108 turned interceptors into flying shotguns meant to shred a cockpit in 1 or 2 passes. But the very tactics that clawed through a B-24's forward shield demanded time, altitude, and the absence of long-range escorts. The Rechlin test team's second conclusion, therefore, did not concern the Liberator at all. It concerned the P-51s that rode herd above and ahead. The Liberator's defensive design punished single fighters that misjudged their line. The arrival of Mustangs punished entire Staffeln that tried to mass before their line was ready. In the files from day battles over Germany between late 1943 and mid-1944, the moments when German pilots managed to exploit the B-24's forward blind cones were almost always those when the escorts were thin or late. The weather broke formations, or a group commander found a lead element exposed for seconds instead of fractions. Rechlin's job was not to sermonize, it was to count. Counting led to one more observation posted without drama. In German bombers, the pilot was often lord of a small domain where gunners guarded arcs on their own. In American heavies, electrical power, turret, hydraulics, intercom discipline, and formation geometry made the gunners a single organism with a common brain sitting in the lead ship's cockpit. The test pilot heard that brain in his headset when he rode jump seat on a captured interphone during a ground run, and listened to how an American crew, recorded on a salvaged training wire, practiced calling ranges, clock positions, and burst lengths. German gunnery manuals taught similar calls, but the Rechlin officers recognized the difference between a doctrine and a system scaled to hundreds of aircraft that trained the same way. The second test day focused on engine-out handling. The Liberators, Pratt & Whitney, are 1830s, were new to German mechanics, but not mysterious. They worked through the start sequence and feathering drills, then lifted to a safe height to simulate combat damage. On 3 engines, the aircraft would hold altitude with proper rudder and aileron. On 2 engines on one side, the pilot had to fight yaw hard and manage speed, ruthlessly, to keep the outer wing from dropping. None of this shocked experienced hands. What mattered to the Luftwaffe men who would brief crews was what happened to the arcs. With one engine feathered and the associated generator offline, turret traverse slowed, and power management became a gunnery problem, not just a flight problem. German intercept leaders claimed to see this in combat, late hit. Liberators with uneven power output lost the choreography that made their boxers lethal. In turn, American engineers had anticipated power failures better than many German designers. The Rechlin team noted the auxiliary drives and redundancy in the B-24's electrical system. Another reminder that American design philosophy accepted weight penalties to preserve systems under stress. A third day, and the pilot pointed the Liberator toward the Müritz waters for low-altitude handling. The airplane's slab sides and long wing made it sensitive to gusts and ground effect, and the nose felt heavy in a flare if the approach was too fast. German pilots joked in the mess that in a crosswind, the B-24 would tell you where it wanted to land, and you would obey. The humor hid respect. Many captured German reports from frontline flak units recorded that damaged Liberators kept flying when they had no business staying in the air, sometimes dragging low over hedgerows in France or Poland long enough to find a field. A fourth day, and the test team calibrated the defensive stations like a clock face and set stopwatches as gunners swung through arcs against towed sleeves. The numbers on the board were less important than their consistency. The powered tail turret transitioned smoothly across the dead zone at 6 o'clock low, where many German pilots tried to nestle before jinking upward for a shot at the fin. The belly position covered its seam with the waist guns better than many Germans expected, especially on late models. The test pilot translated all of this into a simple prescription. An attack that entered a fixed arc and stayed there too long turned a 109 into a ballistic solution for an American gunner trained to bracket a speed and hold a lead. Blitz attacks had to be true, blitz short, violent, coordinated, because the Liberator's gunners were not guessing. They were computing. The most sobering moment for men who had survived the defense of the Reich came in the hangar, not in the air. Rechlin's quartermasters opened crates, captured in freight yards, and inventoried what accompanied a Liberator to war. Spare barrels in numbers that made German armorers wince. Belts of ammunition with tracer intervals that matched training tables. Standardized tools that fit every turret and mount. The Rechlin pilot and his engineering chief wrote the same conclusion in different words. The Liberator's firepower was a river that could be kept full. On the German side, an MG 131 without a barrel swap was a gun that would wear down and slow. On the American side, planners expected sustained operations and shipped the parts to make sustained fire possible week after week. This was not news in Berlin by 1944, but seeing it in one aircraft's ecosystem cut through ideology. The Luftwaffe had brave fighters and brave gunners. The Americans had a pipeline. When the Rechlin pilot briefed a mixed room of fighter and bomber officers, he avoided rhetoric and gave numbers anchored to time, because those were the only arguments that still persuaded men who had read too many condolence letters. A single Liberator's 10 guns, at 120 rounds per second, even assuming only half were in a useful arc at any moment, meant 60 rounds a second available to punish an attacker in the corridor that mattered. A staffel of 12 German fighters executing a head-on was the right idea. But the time window to line up was measured in seconds, and any delay multiplied risk because the escorts were closing from above at rates on the order of a kilometer every 10 to 15 seconds once a bounce began. The conclusion that hung in the air was not that the Liberator was unbeatable. It was that the combinations that made it lethal coherent arcs, disciplined crews, reliable power, and industrial supply were not going away. What the Rechlin pilot admitted privately to a colleague after the room emptied was something harder to place in a report. He had flown German twins, and he had flown this American heavy for the first time in the war. He felt that an enemy aircraft's firepower had been designed from the first rivet to be managed by average men at scale. German machines often shone when touched by experts. The Liberator did not ask for virtuosity to be deadly. It asked for procedure. The airfield's routine closed around the B-24 as the weeks passed. A traveling evaluation team, the so-called Zirkus, that toured frontline units with captured aircraft, requested a demonstration. Weather slipped the schedule. The front moved. The Rechlin pilot took the Liberator up one last time before it rotated to another site. He climbed to a medium altitude where flak hazards were minimal and flew racetracks while the camera ship filmed approach frames one more time. Up here, away from the smell of hot oil and the anxiety of men who had lost too many friends, the airplane felt like what it was, a product of a nation that believed logistics were strategy. The pilot eased the throttles back and imagined the sky the way it had. Looked over Schweinfurt and Berlin when the air turned white with contrails and black with bursts, and the only way through was discipline. The men he had fought called it the bomber stream. He called it a factory in the air. When he slid down final, he could see mechanics on the hardstand sorting belts and barrels and tools, building piles that would follow the aircraft wherever it went. He wrote the last line of his notebook that evening because he knew this test would be archived, and he wanted some other tired man to find it and understand what he had seen. The Liberator's guns were not terrifying because they were large or new. They were terrifying because they were everywhere you needed them to be, supported by a system that made sure they would still be there tomorrow. That truth did not win a dogfight. It did explain why, by mid-1944, daylight over Germany belonged to men who trusted arithmetic more than myth. When the report left Rechlin, it carried the usual caveats. Contemporary records vary on exact gun traverse rates depending on turret type and production blocks. Claimed rates of fire in manuals differ from sustained rates in cold air at altitude. Combat boxes are not static volumes. They breathe with turbulence and human error. But the fundamentals held across sources and videos and wreckage. The Luftwaffe had learned to chip at the front of a formation, and never to dally astern unless a tail was dead. It had learned to mass to survive the forward arcs, and to break immediately when escorts dropped out of the sun. It had learned that a Liberator could be fragile in the wrong failure mode and maddeningly tough in the right one. It had learned, above all, that the volume of fire a formation produced at scales of 20 or 30 aircraft was greater than anything German crews could generate, from any comparable group of machines. That last sentence was the quiet admission embedded in the title some historian would give this episode decades later. Luftwaffe pilots flew a captured B-24 at Rechlin and related fields. They found its handling quirks, mapped its seams, and wrote tactics to kill it. Then they stepped into ready rooms and admitted, in the only language fighter pilots respect, that they had never seen anything like the fire it could put into the sky when it did what it was designed to do. They did not admire the enemy. They respected the machine because the consequences of disrespect were written on the faces of friends who did not come home. The Rechlin pilot signed his name, closed his notebook, and walked out into a June evening that smelled like hot grass and lake water and oil. He watched the Liberator sitting under its canvas, a foreign thing made ordinary by proximity. And he understood that the war would now be decided less by the brilliance of a tactic than by the brute reliability of a system. The next morning he would be back in a 190 or a 109 or a battered test ship wearing new instrumentation. And he would do what he had always done. He would try to make numbers keep men alive for one more week. That was the quiet, unromantic legacy of his flights in the captured bomber. It was not a confession of inferiority. It was an acknowledgement of scale. And in 1944, Germany, scale was the one advantage no pilot, however skillful, could outfly. The Liberator's story, at Rechlin, widened quickly into a map of the war because the aircraft's meaning could not be contained by a test report. On a wall-sized chart in the intelligence hut, the staff pinned colored yarn where B-24 groups had flown in the past year. And the pattern it made explained why the Luftwaffe's pilots were so interested in the machine's teeth. From the oil fields around Ploiesti to the synthetic fuel plants across central Germany, from marshalling yards at Hamm to ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt, the arcs showed daylight pressure that did not pause for winter. When the test pilot and engineering chief briefed their colleagues, they placed the Liberator within that map. Firepower alone did not carry an aeroplane to targets like these. It had to survive long enough for its guns to matter, and survival rested on three pillars that every German officer in the room recognized with a kind of tired clarity: the discipline of the combat box, the arrival of long-range escorts that filled gaps above and ahead, and the American ability to replace lost bombers and crews on a schedule that made tactical victories bittersweet. He narrated a simple thought experiment to fix ideas. Imagine a group of fighters massing for a frontal strike against a 21-ship box at 7,000 meters. The run-in from assembly to firing line might last 60 to 90 seconds, depending on altitude separation and speed. The firing window would be measured in 1 or 2 seconds at best, if the leader held his nerve and closed to short range. In those seconds, if the formation kept its geometry, and if the gunners were disciplined, the corridor in which the 109s or 190s had to place their noses would be sprayed not by one tail or one nose, but by the overlapping torrents the test film had made visible. The probability of a kill for the attackers rose sharply if several cannon strikes hit the cockpit or engines at once. The probability of a loss for the attackers rose sharply if a single pilot drifted out of plan and stayed in one arc too long. That was why the test pilot kept using the word coherent. This was not about a headline number like 10 guns. It was about a machine designed to be flown as one node in a weapon that existed at the scale of dozens. He did not hide the seams Rechlin had found. The B-24's wing carried fuel inboard and was efficient at cruise. But if a fire burned long in the center section, the structure could fail without much warning. Its low-speed manners when heavy demanded precision from crews returning damaged, and a crosswind on a narrow strip could humble even practiced hands. The Liberator also sat lower on its gear than a B-17, and ground fire during a long takeoff roll from forward fields had more bite than charts suggested. But every seam the Germans mapped came with a countervailing habit wound into American training. The crews drilled emergency checklists until power and hydraulics management during damage was muscle memory. The formation's lead and deputy lead rehearsed responses to scattered elements so that geometry reformed quickly after evasions. A waist gunner who lost power understood where the belly turret seam would widen and how. His bursts could cover it for a few seconds. None of this required extraordinary talent. It required ordinary men performing the same roles the same way every day. In the Rechlin mess, that sentence carried as much weight as any performance figure. By mid-1944, German countermeasures had matured into an arsenal of their own, each tuned to the heavy bomber's profile. The 30mm Mk108 cannon on Bf-109G6 and Fw-190A series, fighters delivered a short, heavy burst, intended to kill in 2 or 3 hits. The 21cm Werfer granite rockets fired in salvos disrupted combat boxes and forced gunners to flinch. The so-called Sturmgruppen of heavily armored Fw-190s were built to press into the aft 6 o'clock cone and hold fire until they were close enough to tear a Liberator apart. Against unescorted bombers, these measures worked. loss records and claims from late 1943 and early 1944 show days when bomber groups paid for targets with unsustainable casualties. Against escorted formations, the calculus shifted because the time needed to marshal heavy tactics vanished. The test pilot wrote this as an operational identity, not a complaint. The Liberator's defensive firepower punished mistakes. The Mustangs punished the necessary concentration that made German heavies' tactics effective. The window in which both could be avoided narrowed until luck played a larger role than doctrine. At Rechlin, the engineers tried to translate fire into numbers that could be compared across types. In one series, they measured traverse rates and sustained fire durations at temperature for the Liberator's powered turrets, then normalized the figures as angular degrees covered per second with effective fire. They compared these with German dorsal and tail positions. Even if you downrated the American guns for cold-soaked oil and re-whirled stoppages, the availability of power assistance and the consistency of sighting systems gave the B-24's gunners better odds of dwelling on a fast-moving attacker for the fraction of a second needed. The German conclusion was clinical. If you entered a Liberator's defended space at a predictable relative speed and heading, you were solving a shooting problem for the man you intended to kill. To make the physics work for you, you had to break predictability. Enter on a line that changed late. Fold multiple lines so that no single gunner could pure lead you for a full second. Fire once, leave immediately. Anything else became a mathematics problem in the bomber's favor. The pilot, who had first flown the captured B-24, took those abstractions back into the cockpit during a joint rehearsal with the demonstration staff. The planners set a miniature box with 3 bombers, 2 German stand-ins, and the captured Liberator, and timed controlled runs by 6 fighters. The radio discipline the gunners practiced earlier now became a wall of short sentences. Left waist, 2 o'clock high. Short bursts. Tail clear. Brake left. Resume. The stopwatch in the test director's hand ran the way it always ran, indifferent to courage. In 2 clean head-on passes, the fighters scored annotated hits on the cockpit masks of the stand-ins. In a 3rd pass, one pilot stayed into the follow-through a fraction of a second too long to watch his shells walk, and the Liberator's tail camera caught the invisible arc becoming visible as holes. The lesson was not new. Seeing it from within the American machine made it harder to dismiss as propaganda. The Rechlin files also tracked how the Liberator's defensive scheme meshed with target choice. When 15th Air Force groups from Italy pushed toward Ploiesti in 1943 and 1944, the distances involved and the density of heavy flak made the B-2 for the logical platform. Its cruise efficiency extended reach. Its speed at altitude, while not transformative, stacked with formation geometry to shrink the intercept envelope for 109s climbing from scattered fields. German fuel production could not ignore those raids, so German fighters could not ignore those formations. The Rechlin pilot noted a grim symmetry in his report. Both sides were fighting the same war of fuel. The Liberator's guns were one part of a system designed to keep pressure on the refineries and plants that fed the Wehrmacht. The Luftwaffe's cannon and rockets were one part of a system designed to keep that pressure off long enough for the Reich's factories to catch a breath. By the summer of 1944, the tempo of raids and the depth of escort coverage had turned that breath shallow. He inserted a cautionary paragraph into his final draft because professionals respect the imprecision of combat. Records vary between sources on turret types and ammunition loads across B-24 production blocks. Traverse figures in maintenance manuals differ from what crews reported after hours in the cold. German claims and American loss records do not match for many days, and even when they converge, the fog of combat hides the cause of a falling aircraft. But across this noise, several signals remained stable. Formation geometry concentrated defensive fire more effectively than any German bomber formation. Powered standardized turrets increased the chance that average gunners could deliver a lethal second, and the American supply chain kept those probabilities high over months, not weeks. One evening after flying, the test pilot visited the captured equipment park that fed Rechlin's trials. In one row stood a B-17 with patches on its nose, where ground crews had smoothed over flak damage for the ferry flight that captured it. Further down sat a Mitchell and the wreckage of a Lightning. The men who kept this graveyard in order were machinists by trade. They had grown used to the task of making sense of foreign screws and threads and gauges. He listened to them talk about crates of .50 caliber barrels and belts that arrived with American bombers, and the contrast with German practice. In a Reich worried about copper and nickel and skilled labor, gunners learned to nurse barrels and stretch intervals between swaps. In an American system built for throughput, planners assumed barrels would be changed on schedule. Firepower, he realized, was not the feeling of a trigger pulled hard. It was the assurance that the trigger would feel the same next week and the week after, with a new barrel and a fresh belt. When word filtered back from frontline fighter wings about tactics that worked against liberators, Rechlin's team consolidated them with specifics. Mass head-on attacks still ranked high, with leaders emphasizing very short burst discipline to avoid time in arc. Breaking up a box with rockets before closing remained a viable preface, provided timing and altitude were correct. Attacks from high 6 o'clock that slid into undertail cones could succeed if a tail turret was damaged, and a belly turret was out or unpowered. But every one of these prescriptions came with an asterisk that officers underlined more than once. None were reliable when escorts were overhead in strength. The report did not moralize about what that meant. Men who flew did not need a lecture to understand that battlefield geometry, not sentiment, had started to decide the air war. He wrote one last piece, a technical aside that read like a confession to anyone who understood subtext. Compared to German twins, such as the Ru-88 or Ju-217, the Liberator's system asked less of virtuosity and more of procedure. In the cockpit, that meant checklists that could be followed in poor conditions and redundancy that allowed mistakes to be corrected before they killed. In the gun positions, that meant repeatable drills that compensated for the average eye. In the formation, that meant leaders who managed positions and tempo instead of improvising into weather and hope. He did not pretend German aviators lacked discipline. He did suggest that the design and the training behind this American heavy made discipline easier to standardize. In a war where exhaustion and attrition hollowed out squadrons, making discipline easier was an advantage as real as an extra 20 kilometers per hour at altitude. By early July, the captured Liberator left Rechlin for another field, where the traveling evaluation unit would show it to crews who had not yet seen Allied metal up close. The test pilot watched it lift into a sky already busy with summer operations. He walked back to the office, where annotations for big weeks after action reports still lay open in a folder, and closed the Liberator file with a hand that hesitated just a second. The men he had briefed would fly into those boxes again tomorrow. Some would fire rockets and live long enough to see their arcs take effect. Some would stretch a beat too long into a forward cone and feel a thunk on the airframe that meant a gunner had solved their speed. He was a professional, not a poet. He did not think about symbolism. He thought about how to give them one more edge in a fight, whose context none of them could change. The war answered with its own arithmetic. As the summer advanced, the refineries and synthetic fuel plants, the liberators and fortresses hunted began to fail more often and for longer. German fighter operations contracted around fuel and training limits that no bravery could offset. When the Rechlin pilot later read aggregated figures for sorties flown versus sorties planned, he saw the decline plotted as a line with its own implacable slope. The Liberator had never been invulnerable. It had been part of a system that proved resilient enough to keep pressure on the point that mattered most. If a German fighter broke through a forward cone and killed a bomber, the group closed ranks, and the pipeline back in England or Italy filled the slot. If an American gunner's barrel wore and his traverse slowed, a new barrel and a ground crew with spare parts made him lethal again next week. That was what he had tried to capture in his notes when he wrote that the aircraft's firepower was everywhere you needed it to be. He meant the guns. He also meant the industry behind. After the war, men on both sides would revisit these files with calmer eyes. Engineers would argue about whether the B-24's Davis wing and high aspect ratio represented a necessary compromise or an avoidable risk. Crewmen would debate whether the B-17's steadier three-engine behavior made it a better mount for the deepest targets once escorts were guaranteed. Historians would trace how often German Sturmgruppen succeeded and how quickly the Mustang's arrival bent those curves. In that analysis, the Rechlin pilot's notes would look unremarkable, qualified, free of drama. He would have preferred that judgment. The job had never been to dramatize. It had been to describe reality well enough that men who had to live inside it could make choices with their eyes open. There is a plain sentence at the end of his last entry that some archivist's pencil later underlined. It says that firepower applied at scale changes what tactics mean. He had flown dozens of types by then, some beloved, some cursed. The captured Liberator reminded him that weapons are not only what is bolted into a fuselage, they are also the training programs that make average hands deadly, and the supply trains that make next week look like this week. When Luftwaffe, pilots at Rechlin and other fields, admitted quietly and without theatrics that they had not seen fire like a combat box of Liberators could produce, they were not yielding to awe. They were acknowledging a truth that would shape the remainder of the war over Germany. The sky was becoming a place where procedure, numbers, and logistics punished improvisation and myth. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.